In episode 23 of Have the Nerve, Be Curious, Not Judgemental, we talked about primary school students with a disability. I started by telling you about a dart scene in Ted Lasso against a man named Rupert. But I actually didn't tell you the full scene. After Ted says to Rupert, I saw a quote by Walt Whitman that said, "Be curious, not judgmental." He goes on to say, "All of it suddenly hit me. All those fellas who had belittled me, not a single one of them are curious. They thought they had everything figured out, so they judged everything and they judged everyone." Amanda and Jodie are back to talk about disability and high school.
Hi, my name's Amanda Lane Brown. I'm a clinical psychologist that's worked for over 20 years in the area of rehabilitation and often work with kids with spinal injury or neurological impairment.
Hi, I'm Jodie Thompson. I'm a paediatric nurse consultant, currently working out in the community, but have previously worked for 26 years in the area of paediatric rehabilitation and disability.
We talk about self-esteem, raging hormones, bullying, and the endless cycle of trying to be someone you aren't. This episode does come with a trigger warning. We do talk about suicidal ideations and self-harm, so listener discretion is advised. Well, welcome back, guys. Today we're going to talk about the transition between primary school and high school. Does anybody want to talk about some of the key issues that can be arising for children? Doesn't matter if they're SCI or neurological disabilities, particularly things around preparation for a new routine, new types of social interactions, and the actual setting of a high school.
Yeah, it's a big shift for kids going from primary school to high school for any child, and particularly a child who has extra support needs as they're transitioning. So I think a big part that can be helpful is to try and have as many visits to the school as possible so the place becomes a bit more familiar before starting, figuring out any new routines and having a good chance to practice those, because often they might be going further away, they might be needing to be getting up earlier in the morning to get through different routines, and the getting around the schools can be a shift from the primary school setting where you're mainly in one classroom. And this is probably a bit earlier before transition, but the kids that seem to find it easier have had the chance to become as independent as possible in those kind of later years of primary school. So even things like the self-care, doing their own catheters, those sorts of things, if possible, if they can be more independent in those, and that's really already a ingrained skill for them, then it's not something they're needing to shift in high school as well.
I was going to say for a lot of schools now, I think that whole transition to high school has been well recognised as being a major jump for a lot of kids, especially in like mainstream schools. They're very much introducing that concept of even doing school visits to the local high school. Happens like in year 5, I think it was, and then they do another sort of visits and stuff in year 6, so they start to prepare to be going to high school. Now, for children who are going to high school that may have additional needs that may or may not be able to be met by their local high school, I think that creates potentially a bit of a worry for them, because it means that they're kind of leaving not only friendships, but they may need to go to a different high school that are better supportive of their needs. And just depends on, if that school is accessible or not, and if they have the right supports in place, irrespective of kind of what the disability or impairment may be, and things. And so recognition, I guess, of that, moving to high school, it's a big thing, but having those early supports in place and getting, as Amanda said, getting that independence as much as possible is really, really the key. I think it's really hard for a lot of people if they're having to move to a different high school because the local high school doesn't meet their needs. So there needs to be a lot of integration support for that young person moving into a new high school where they may not have people that they know. So in terms of that friendship jump and a new environment with new carers or new teachers is a huge step for them.
I didn't really think about until just now. So when somebody with the disability is transitioning in from primary to high school and their care needs might be more, and then the school you're kind of dictated by the type of school you're going to. A lot of people in primary school will move to a high school where their friends are, because it's that security. And so I guess there's now an added level of fear. Their friends are not coming with them. What is the best way for a student to be able to prepare themselves for that sort of change, I guess?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that can help there, especially if they're needing to go to a school where they don't know people. I guess the first, and this isn't always possible, but even if there's one or two familiar people, if there's some opportunity through the school to get to know one or two other students before starting, that having someone around can feel, a student can feel much more comfortable if there's someone that they know there. And often the schools might be willing to try and support that. I guess the other thing is there's probably going to be quite a lot. If someone has a physical disability, there might be a lot of kids asking them questions when they first start. So it can help to have kind of like a script that the kid's really comfortable with saying, that in terms of explaining their disability, and that they can just kind of trot out and say without really thinking and feeling like they have to think about it too much, or it's an emotional thing to be saying. So sometimes it can help, because often in the primary schools, they've been around these kids. They started in kindy. They've been around these kids for a long time. It was probably almost explained to the other children when they were in kindy. That's not happening in year 7. So just having a chance to practice exactly what they're going to say and saying it again and again can help. I guess there might also be like a different script or a different way of explaining it that people have for just the random child that they don't know coming up and asking, versus someone that they're getting closer to and they're becoming better friends with and they want to share a little bit more with. I think the other thing on top of that can be helpful for kids to think about is not just having the script of how they're going to explain things, but then how they're going to shift away from that, so that they get a chance to move and maybe develop friendships beyond the first conversation about their disability. They can also be then building friendships about, what do you like? Or I really like doing this activity, and what do you like? And I guess a way to ask the person they're talking to questions about themselves, and getting to explain some things about the child can explain some of the things that they like that's beyond their disability as well. Then what other things can they be having in common? And also for kids, it can be quite overwhelming, the thought that everyone's going to ask them these questions. So also just being aware that these queries kind of fade down with time. They're intense at first, but then it fades down. That it can be really good for kids not only to think about these script about what's going on for them physically, but also what are their strengths and what are they really good at and what do they enjoy, and focusing on those. And that can be part of the shifting away as well to a new conversation. These are the things I love. This is what I really enjoy doing. So it's not such a conversation just about differences.
And I think they do a lot of that work in terms of those icebreaker type activities, especially as the kids move into year 7. They tend to sort of try to get people to open up and to meet, different people throughout the year to see if they can start to find their tribe, and gaining some common ground, finding some commonalities with other students and things in the year. Again, that is beyond just their disability. It's about them as a person, and it is that concept of, be curious, not judgmental. It's about asking the person about it. If you're curious about their disability, well, just ask them in a very respectful way. And I think children, as they're growing up, are starting to learn to celebrate what's good about them and their strengths, and also to find out what differences they have, or what makes me different to others, but that's not necessarily good or bad, and that it's very much about that everyone is different, and how can I find and get the best out of people, I guess, by learning about them and asking questions, and then finding commonality in things that you enjoy potentially together, interests, and activities and things like that. Hopefully that's fostered by the schools about doing a lot of those kind of icebreaker activities so that they get opportunities to interact with lots of different people, and eventually those kids will find, all kids will find their tribe.
Yeah, because we didn't really discuss this in the last episode. I guess it's probably a bit more pertinent now when you're trying to find yourself, or you're about to enter into a high school, which is a bigger population, people you're unfamiliar with, you're a small fish in a big pond again. There could be people out there who might think that every conversation is going to be about their disability, or they need to only discuss their disability, when, you know, you can have one person, another person, be totally interested in Star Wars, and you won't know it until you ask those questions at a you don't need to make it all about your disability. I remember myself, for example, I would just start talking about my disability, even if people didn't ask, because I thought that was my whole personality. It's actually not. You know, people might default to talking about that sort of thing. When growing up and getting older and then moving into adulthood, you start to learn that these things are not, they are you, but they're not all you. Yeah,
they don't define you. And I think there's a lot of work to be done with children, you know, in those kind of later years of primary school, about that whole knowing who you are and what makes you you, and what are your strengths and what are your interests, so that when they come to high school, they have a better idea about the things that make them tick and things that they can then use to relate to other children and things as well. And I talk about this as we're coming out of kind of the COVID, this last 3 years really of COVID, where children really struggle. And I can talk from personal experience, even with my daughter coming out of that period of time of being locked away at home for so many months of those years, and then having to get out there and be social again, and the confidence that kids, or the lack of confidence that kids currently have moving into that space. The year sevens have struggled, I tell you, this year, and it's a very different population of children in how they relate to their peers, even compared to, say, for example, my son's year, which is he's going to year 11 this year. They relate to a whole different bunch, a very tight bunch compared to the year sevens of this year. So you've also got those external factors of kind of what's even happened, and then the knock to children's confidence and the building of those social skills that normally would have happened in these last few years has been almost hindered. And so your ability to be able to relate then to peers when you're moving into that year seven kind of space has been really challenging for a lot of kids. And so we need to sort of, you know, almost encourage them to be reflective. What makes you you, those ways of being able to connect with their peers and to find common ground and things as well.
That's a kind of across the board challenge with all kids, that the social skills, it seems to be coming up in all the schools at a lot of different years, is the social skills that kids would normally gain in the last 2 years when they've been at home, has meant that they haven't gained those social skills, so they're having more difficulty relating to their peers, and they're relating to their peers in different ways. But it is tricky. It's definitely not just for the kids starting year 7. I'd say that's an across-the-board issue. The part about differences is, and talking about disability, is people do ask that, and that we are, as humans, we're kind of hardwired to notice differences in people. But that's not a negative difference. That's just a noticing. So if people are asking about disability or about a wheelchair or something like that, that can be more of an interest. It doesn't mean it's a negative thing.
Because it moves quite seamlessly into a topic about self-esteem, and trying to maintain and retain your self-esteem as somebody who looks different from a lot of other people. And you might be one of very few people with disabilities in your high school, and talked about the small fish, big pond thing. But we're also up against things like, I was going to say social media, but that's not true, because even through high school, even if you're looking at magazines of people, you're looking at television and that sort of thing, you're always seeing people that are not reflecting you. And as somebody who is growing up with a disability, who's always trying to find somebody to reflect them, to make them feel like, oh, I am represented, it can really take a toll on somebody's self-esteem. And it also kind of like they could possibly be trying to emulate a style or a look or a something.
It is something that has improved over time. So there are some really strong advocates and people that are in kind of mainstream media, I guess like the Dylan Alcotts and people like that, that are widely known now. And I guess even for younger kids, it's becoming more and more common that toys and dolls and things like that are representing people with disabilities. They're often represented in TV shows and things. So I think things are improving, but it is challenging if you're seeing everyone else represented in a way that's not you. So it doesn't look the same as you.
Because I guess what I'm saying is, like, there are people out there who have just recently found themselves reflected in mainstream media, but there is still an entire subset of people who are just not reflected in mainstream media that could really take a toll on somebody's self-esteem if they're in a school or in an area where they're like, I'm the only one with a disability.
Yeah, I think we are getting better at portraying the people with a variety of needs, especially in that social media, but also in like film and television and things. I think we're getting far more exposure, not just if you had a physical disability, if you had an intellectual disability or, mental health, you know what I mean? Lots of things are being represented now. And I think coming out of what we have seen with the pandemic and stuff is the idea that kindness is key.
So I think there is this view of greater acceptance of difference, but I also take the point that for kids who have a physical disability, I think there's more acceptance of, yes, there is differences with everyone, but some differences are easier to hide than others. And that can be challenging for a kid who has a physical disability because their differences are seen on the outside quite easily. And it can also be that trying to find those strengths that the person has, the commonalities that they have with other people, they are more than their disability. But masking does happen a lot with kids who have physical disabilities and with all range of disabilities. I think you see it really kicking in high school, particularly around that kind of year 8 mark. And it's a time where a lot of teenagers are they're sick of the differences and they're sick of all of the things they need to do and all of the processes and the things like doing the catheters and doing the bowel routines and all of those things. They're just over it. And it's a challenging time because trying to mask and fit in can then lead to other health issues. For example, if it's maybe a pressure area and then they're having to have time off school, or some kids are going to school on beds or things like that, that it's actually making a greater difference for them, or making, in a way, they're standing out more because of that, or they're missing school and not having the chance to build those social relationships as much as the other kids are. So it's a real challenge about that age to try and find ways to encourage keeping going with all of these things that they need to do so that actually they can get the most positive experience out of their schooling and seeing that it's a good thing to be doing these things, to be keeping themselves physically healthy and doing all of the maintenance that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's a really big challenge for a lot of children who are required to do catheters and things in school. So they don't want to miss out the times that they're often doing that. They don't want to miss out on the social time. They don't want to be off doing catheters when they could be socialising with their friends. And so in doing so, sometimes they choose not to do them. And then we know that can obviously have health repercussions, not a great long-term solution about, managing bladders is a highly important thing for them, especially in these early years. So for their long-term health. As much as I can, I certainly know my approach was let's try to keep any sort of medicalised stuff to the minimum that we need to do within that school environment. Everyone needs to have routines are exceptionally important, doing it at certain times. But if there's an option for some of that stuff to happen outside of those school hours, sometimes we can't avoid that. We know that has to happen at certain times. But if we can, so that the kids, we're maximising their, opportunities for learning and socialisation without needing to kind of cloud it with too many other medicalised things that they need to do during the daytime.
I think also that idea of separating as much as possible the medical side from the kind of learning and the social side, but also thinking in terms of academic learning, the kids are not going to learn very well if they're emotionally distressed or not socialising well and they're worried about peer relationships. So actually those social times are really important. And I guess sometimes from the school system, they're looking at, right, are they meeting the learning requirements? But they're not going to be able to do that if they're really emotionally distressed. Also prioritising that social time and positive social interactions can be really helpful, not only for their self-esteem and how they're feeling, but also for their academics, because they're going to be able to concentrate more in class then.
Of the 30 positive social interactions you might have, there could be like 2 very, very negative continuous interactions. Somebody's going into high school and they're not telling people about what they have to do, like the catheterization, the toileting. It's not even about that. But it could be even just down to physical appearance, which again is like an offset of if you're not seeing them reflected, or if you're not seeing them well reflected for you, and then somebody is also making fun of your physical appearance, it could really play quite heavily on your self-esteem. And I read this very shocking statistic when I was doing a little bit of research for this episode. More than half, 62% of students with autism spectrum disorder report being bullied once or more during a week, and that's someone with ASD, which is not really like our audience, but it's still such a shocking statistic that is happening, because there's a lot of external factors. If a student is faced with repeated remarks from very few, but it's always the very few that people really pay the closest attention to, what can we do to try and, or what can the student do? What can we do?
Okay, I guess people who bully are looking for a reaction. So they tend to pick on people who are looking like something bad's going to happen, or they react quickly, or they become upset, or they become angry. So I guess to start with, it's partly about the reaction of the person who's being bullied, which is a really difficult thing to do. So of trying to look like it's not bothering you or something like that is very, very difficult to do. So I think if someone's being verbally bullied, talking to someone that they trust about it and able to talk about it until they no longer feel upset about what the person's saying, about trying to work out why that person's wrong about what they've said, going through what they're good at, reminding themselves of those often so that they have a way to be able to counteract in their head what the bully's saying. And then it makes it much easier to not react in that really upset or angry way. I guess the other thing is, though, if we're talking about physically bullying someone, that's almost another level as well. And really then you need to be getting someone in a position of authority to help you with that situation. So you need someone who can stop that happening. I guess sometimes people feel like, it's going to make more of a big deal about it if I go to tell someone about it. If it's a physical bullying, then something needs to be done about it. With the verbal bullying, it can be about, for the person who's been bullied, trying to find a way that they can deal with it so it doesn't upset them, they're not giving the response that the bully wants. There's a lot of advice often about going to the school, but a lot of kids don't want to do that. They could go speak to the teacher or someone about something about it, but most kids aren't willing to do that. So talking to someone about it, though, can really help.
Bullying in schools is rife. There is absolutely no question about that, and that goes across the board. And this tolerance that we have for people, again, to be looking for the differences and the negative in people is rife. I don't know if they feel it's okay to then treat others like that. It's almost like people have been given an increased authority to feel they're important enough that they can treat others badly. And I think the conversation around that, has led to new policies and things being implemented in schools about anti-bullying policies, which for a lot of it looks great on paper, but on the day-to-day interactions that children have, it is more reflective as a society about what we allow our children and how we model behaviours in our children about what's okay to do and what's not, because often we're seeing the adults that are also treating others badly, and their children will then feel that that's okay to do as well. Respect happens at home, what you allow. If my children, for example, were, saying things to other people, or they wouldn't be because they would know what's best for them, but if they were talking about someone in a negative way, I would question them about that. Why do you feel that you have the right to judge others? Why are you not being supportive, or why are you not finding out more information about that? It's a really interesting space where we almost had this circuit breaker called COVID. There was a lot of anti-bullying stuff happening prior to COVID. Then everyone went into lockdown. And then suddenly we were all removed, and then things, of course, probably then moved online more so. So if that was happening, it was happening on an online forum. And now that we're back all face-to-face and things, we lost a little bit of that momentum, I think, of that anti-bullying sentiment. And now I think it's ramping up again because they're noticing that people are coming out the other side of COVID with increasingly poor self-esteem, poor social skills, higher anxiety, higher rates of depression, coming out this other side. And as we're normalizing back into life, that whole idea of that bullying and things again, it's kind of flared up a little again with everyone having a little bit shorter wicks. It's super challenging. I think it's a very challenging space that children are navigating at the moment within schools.
I think the other thing there is that the person doing the bullying often has a lot of emotional difficulties for some reason. So one side is focusing, I guess what I was talking about before, is focusing on the response to bullying for the person being bullied. But from the school side, it's also needing to look more and more at the person that is doing the bullying, what's going on for them, because something's not right for them, and how can they address the issues for that child who's doing the bullying. Which is a difficult space, but also a very necessary one.
And just like from personal experience, the bullying feels like it never ends because it's every day. And you're going to school for 7 to 12, that's 6 years of consistent stuff happening. But there reaches a point where people hit, I don't know, for me, it was year 11, and something happened, and it was at that point where I was like, I'm not going to live this way anymore. And I went and found, I guess, my tribe. The bullying actually ends, and you are able to become a much better person for yourself. You can find your people or whatever, and then you go into adulthood. It feels like forever because it's every single day, which, might mean that people feel like, well, what am I even doing here? And then they'll be like, trigger warning, there could be suicidal ideations, there could be will this ever end? But it does end. It really does end.
Well, I think what you're talking about as well is that feeling of lack of control, that when kids are at school, they are going to the school with these same kids every day. And that can feel like, I'm going to be forced, I'm going to be up against this. It can be also then, as you said, you had this shift of right, no, I'm not going to live like this anymore. I'm going to go find other people to hang out with, and I'm going to take that control. So you took over the situation and said, I can't control what that person who's bullying me says, but I can control what I do. And so I can go and find different friends, and I can take control and do things the way that I want to do. And it's difficult for kids because they don't have as much control as an adult. And as an adult, you'd be saying, okay, this person is saying these horrible things. I'm going to just distance myself from them. I'm not going to go anywhere near them. Whereas it's harder to do that in a school setting. So I think the children taking the control that they can, and maybe that's going and finding their own tribe. Maybe that's, and I think it sounds like you also went for the things that you enjoyed and that you found like like-minded people that liked you for different ways.
Oh, I'm still friends with them 21, 22 years after I decided I would dump all the other people and then become friends with these people. Like, they are solid friendships.
I think that's the thing too, that often these comments are coming from quite kind of social relationships, and they might be within the same group, same social group. The kids don't have to stay with those people. They could be looking at other friends and other groups. And there is a very difficult period that happens around that year 8, year 9, year 10, and often seems to settle by kind of the end of high school towards year 11, year 12. It's getting much better. It does get to the other side, and I think it's taking control of the things that you can control. And you can't control what other people do, but you can look at controlling your own reactions and what you choose to do and who you choose to hang out with.
I think there's a lot of work to be done in that personal development of children, and as they move into that high school and they're starting to know about who they are and what they represent, I think there's a lot of work to be done in boosting that in our teenagers, about getting them to a point where it's okay for people not to like you because you don't like everyone. So, why would they think that everyone would like you? And that's okay. And I think that if we get kids to kind of have that internal mantra and dialogue that they're okay exactly as they are, I think that idea that it almost creates that shield so that when bullying occurs, it's more of a reflection of that other person and it doesn't actually dent their armor. There is a lot of work that we can do with young people about, having that better internal armor for them to actually be able to deal. So when they come across things like bullying, for whatever reason, that they are able to, for that just to kind of bounce off them, and having that understanding, I guess, of it's more about that other person than of you yourself. Learning how not to react. And that's really hard because impulse control, especially in those early teenage years, is not the best. And so the first thing people want to do often is to kind of bite back or retreat. Teaching children about respect and respect of others, again, celebrating differences. I think that if we learn one thing coming out of this, pandemic, is that the idea of kindness to others is an important part of, and tolerance and things is a very important part of how people should be relating to other people.
I think it's also it kind of links in with these kind of ideas for self-esteem as well, and working on the positive coping strategies of things like socializing with those people that you find really supportive or that you enjoy spending time with, doing something each day that you really like that makes you feel good. It might be something little or it might be something bigger, and doing things like relaxation strategies or meditation or whatever it is, that getting outside, whatever it is that makes you feel good, and using those positive coping strategies, because particularly kind of in the parts of high school, sometimes those negative coping strategies can come in more of things like withdrawing or alcohol or drugs or kind of neglecting the essential care needs that you might need to be doing. And they might make someone feel better in the short term briefly, but then they create their own problems and they make things much harder. Like the next day, the bullying's still there and now you're feeling terrible as well. So it's trying to focus on those positive coping strategies rather than using the things that aren't really going to be helpful for you.
Yeah, if you're using negative coping strategies, let's just say, you're too young to access alcohol and you're not taking drugs and that sort of thing, and like you've decided you're going to take it on yourself, and those can continue on into your adulthood. Like it's not like it's going to like go away. The bullying will go away, but your coping strategy will continue on well into adulthood.
It's tricky because those negative coping strategies can become a habit, and then it's like trying to break that habit. which is any habit can be tricky to break, and it takes some real work and thought and intention to be saying, I'm going to do something in a different way. So I guess as parents, then it's trying to help the kid, your child or kids, or for teachers trying to help the students to be teaching them these other ways of coping and trying to find something that, because different things work for different people. What is it that makes this kid feel better and cope better? So I think it is teaching children also from a younger age as well, like even in the primary years and before, it can be a lot from modelling as well, but trying to teach kids from a young age different ways that they can cope and make themselves feel better, so that they don't have to go for I don't know what to do, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'll do this thing, which makes me feel better right now but might not be helpful in the long run.
You have to be in love with yourself first, right? For other people to like you, or, that sort of mantra. And I guess this also moves into things like during high school, you're actually witnessing other people get into relationships, a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is. And it can be difficult to try and sort of see where you sit amongst your peers if they don't have disabilities and they're in relationships, and how the other person would be able to, for lack of a better term, deal with your disability in a relationship. In the last episode, we talked about going through primary school and not knowing where the line is for personal space. And so I guess this is almost next level personal space, and we're doing all these things and we've got all these medical appointments. We might not know where to draw the line, or we might not think that we are worthy of relationships. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that for a lot of people, and especially with spinal cord injuries, depends on what age of which you've had the spinal cord injury for, there is a lot of physical handling and a lot of intimate procedures that are done for children to assist them with managing for things, for example, bowel, bladder, that type of thing, early in their life, if that's for when they've experienced or had the spinal cord injury, if they haven't had it from birth. And a lot of that kind of medical touching by lots of different people over the time and things, I think would have a significant impact on relationship building, moving from, we try to get people as independent as they can be with most of their cares, if that's physically possible for them. Because for some people, it depends on the level of a spinal cord injury, for example, that you may not have the function to be able to get to attend for those cares yourself. And so moving from medical touching, or people that carers and things, you will have different people. It transitions, I guess, from being often parents that will do a lot of those care needs for you, moves on to then carers, and that's often a really big step for families to allow other people who are not themselves to actually provide those cares and things for their child. And then that kind of, I think, can affect relationships, because intimate touching is a very separate thing, and knowing where that line is from going from carers to understanding then and relating to others who haven't had a lot of that, and it's not just for cares, but for a lot of children, they've actually had lots of negative associations with touching related to medical procedures they've had to have done, which have been super uncomfortable and not very nice. So from touching in a sensory perspective, it can actually be a very negative thing, which can then affect people's ability for physical relationship building with peers as they get into those teenage and later teenage years, moving into adulthood and things. I think there is a significant impact on that, and for people to understand that the differences, and I guess having a good self-esteem and knowing what, you still get all the same feelings and all the same emotions attached to building relationships. And it's important then from the physical side of things, there's probably a lot of mystery from anyone who potentially would want, to form a relationship with you. And again, it's about asking the questions and being the person feeling safe to be able to discuss those needs with another person. Who they want to enter a relationship with. But initially, often, I guess, they start as a lot of friendships, and then move from friendships to then developing, I guess, further feelings, and then feeling very comfortable and safe, I guess, because a lot of that, their associations with touch have been around medical and not intimate, pleasure needs. It's always been that. So I think it's a really big transition for people to actually be able to, to kind of accept or be very comfortable in that space. The cure for that is communication, about what you would, what you're feeling and what you're happy for people to know about you and understand about you, and how they then can relate to you on a physical level as well as an emotional level.
Yeah, I think a big part of what you're saying there as well, Jodie, is that people don't understand necessarily. It could almost be that what someone's comfortable in saying, but it often might be with a close friend to start with, and communicating what works for them, what feels good, and how a relationship would be building.
I was just also thinking about how sex education in high schools is mainly around able-bodied education, and so it doesn't really factor in other people. And so then you get conversations where you're like, can you? And you're like, don't know. Like, or yes or no or whatever, because there's no real education for the diverse people that you can come across. God forbid you might be attracted to somebody with a disability. What do you do then?
Yeah, and I think it's an area that probably needs a bit more focus within the schooling systems or in the younger years, because I think as people with disabilities have in adulthood, there's more and more awareness of this, and there are special clinics that have been set up and specifically for sexuality and to help with education and understanding. And I think that is, and it's reasonably recent within the adult space. And it's starting to come down a little bit in age, but it's still an area that needs a lot more work about that, just general education that, as you say, people with some kind of diversity, there needs to be an education about sex education, how it works for everyone.
I think there's a huge, we've always known there's been a huge need and stuff in this area, and especially of sexuality and disability, and, the questions around consent has been a very big one over the years, but also people knowing their own bodies, like even going through high school and understanding, different bodily functions and how your body works from a sexuality perspective, and feelings and emotions. I don't think they actually address that well in sex education. It's all about the mechanics and things. They kind of know the basics, but really don't know kind of the bigger picture of sexuality and sexual health and developing and that in relation, that in respect to relationship. And it has started to be addressed. There's certainly, as I said, some of the adult services now have been setting up sexuality clinics specifically in the area of spinal cord injury, and there's service providers out there now that are doing a lot more webinars and education sessions for not only for, parents to help educate their children, but also for the people themselves that, learning how your body may work slightly differently, knowing that you've got a spinal cord injury, but can still be as enjoyable and fulfilling. And it's just understanding about how you do that in a way that is safe as well as a pleasurable experience and things for you. And there's so much possibility, but people really don't talk about it. And we need to be talking about it more so and quite openly in those teenage years so that people feel very comfortable and they know. So when they get those questions, of people saying, well, can you? It's just like, well, I can, but there's certain things that for boys and girls are a little bit different in terms of the mechanics of what can happen or can't, but there's ways around that, of how we can approach that. And that education definitely is, it's an acknowledgement that it needs to be done better. And I think we're just starting to work on that now and actually be able to, but this goes across the board. This is not even just for people with, a variety of diverse, disabilities and things. It is across the board that our teenagers need to have some better education about that. I certainly know there's been a lot of work done in schools at the moment, especially around that kind of year 10 sort of mark. I know because my son's school has been very big on the whole consent. There's been a very big push about respectful relationships. Consent has been a very big part of their education and things at school, as being external providers coming in and talking about that generally and things. But certainly learning about that and learning relationships and that the sexual functioning and things like that, having a better understanding of that earlier and knowing what's to come like at the respective ages, but what's possible in the future, I think does help for relationship building with others as you're then aging.
Yeah, and I guess it's that idea as well about understanding your own body and what is good for you and what feels better and that it's different for every person. So it's also, I guess, as Jodie is saying, it's something that needs more work but is starting to be addressed. But it's also probably working from the clinician side with parents and with teenagers, parents when they're younger children and teenagers as well, and just starting to address these issues earlier rather than kind of getting to adulthood and then services start becoming available.
I guess it also feeds into the person with the disability feeling a bit more confident about themselves, and then transitioning from like high school into adulthood. So you've already got the building blocks of like you're confident about who you are as a person, no matter what situation, with like a little bit more self-esteem, a little bit more confidence, and also I guess in a way. It's not just about them, it's about, if you've got education around disability for people you're the only person with a disability in a room full of able-bodied people, and then they're learning new things, they're taking that information into adulthood as well without having to even,
Yeah, I think it is. The more people know, then the less of an issue it becomes for everyone. And it's that challenge as well, I guess, about when you're talking about education. I think it's education a lot as well for the person who has a disability. And it needs to be across the board, but if the person who has a disability has a good understanding and feels comfortable and confident talking to others, then because it's a bit different for everyone, then they can be saying what's comfortable for them. I think as well with things like puberty happening earlier for girls particularly, that these conversations do need to start reasonably early.
When we talk about it from a physical disability side of things, there's also overlays of if you had a cognitive impairment or an intellectual disability. I think that some of those conversations and things are exceptionally important about, body image, appropriate boundaries, appropriate touching, some of those things, and also having conversations about how you relate to others. So I know certainly in the intellectual disability space, it's like someone's only got to show slight interest in you, and then it gets potentially misinterpreted as like they like me, they like me, not just this is a friendship. And so that's where there can be a little bit of kind of, I guess, blurring of boundaries, and so education, I guess, is really important. And I work a lot I now in sort of the intellectual disability space, and for a lot of the drives for some of the young people that I work with, they're very driven for physical contact, intimacy with others, and being able to do that in a very safe way. It can be super challenging during those teenage years moving into adulthood, about learning some of those skills about keeping yourself safe and things as well.
The intention of this entire episode is that I just basically want to see a whole generation of children with disabilities feel okay about being in their bodies, totally okay with people not being okay with them, because you're not going to be liked by everybody. The tools, I guess, of confidence to be able to go into adulthood without, feeling like they're always going to be the other.
Well, I think you said a really nice point before, which is saying you realised you were so much more than your disability. I guess that's what I'd really like to get across to particularly the kind of adolescent ages, well, all kids but with a disability, but especially that adolescent age where I think it becomes a real concern for them, is they are so much more than that. And there's all of these wonderful things about all of these kids. So it's trying to get them to hone in on what are those strengths and see those, because then a lot of these other issues become much easier to deal with as well.
I think exactly what you're saying, Amanda. I think that if we work on children's self-esteem and have that as a very important part from early days about teaching them about their differences themselves. So you might notice that so-and-so has a difference and you have a difference, and that's all okay. And that celebrating those differences is really important, so that they feel really good about themselves. It builds that resilience. So when they come across really tough times, if they experience bullying or, at different things in their lives, they're able to bounce back about that, because the person they are at their core, they know who they are. It's encouraging people to look for the good in others.
We've discussed high school students trying so hard to not be different from their peers, right? But then when you leave high school and you go out in the big wide world, it's all the differences that make you the most attractive. You know what I mean?
We're talking about finding a tribe, and that's great if you can do that. But in terms of self-esteem and mental health, really one friend makes a big difference. One supportive person that the kid can go and talk to and understands them makes a massive difference. You actually only need that one. It doesn't have to be in school. It could be out of school. Then that's going to really be a lovely protective factor. And I think going from what Jodie was saying about teaching kids these ways to have their self-esteem improve from a really young age, it's that nice prevention rather than getting to the point where someone's depressed or suicidal and then you're trying to do an intervention there and help them. And you're also talking about negative coping strategies and kind of how they've become a bit of a habit. Trying to shift those is harder. If we can do it younger and teach kids this resilience and self-esteem, then it adds this barrier so that there's not the degree of issues later on. And I guess the other thing is, though, for the adults out there is to be saying, yeah, it's great if we can do this early. But if that hasn't happened, there's always ways that we can change and that we can learn these things. It's never too late. There's always ways to look after ourselves better and to find our strengths and find those people around us that do support us.
You've been listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. This episode was written, edited and produced by me, Susan Wood, logo art by Kobe and more. If you like this episode or this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're on social media, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. This podcast is part of our resource hub. Check the show notes below to visit the link or go to scia.org.au. And finally, if you know someone who's struggling with self-identity and who they are, share this episode with them. Being in a body that is different is hard, but struggling for answers by yourself is even harder. Thank you for listening.